Well, here we are again. Now we are moving from the Civil War to talking about Reconstruction and beyond. I hope you like my pop culture reference there. So, let's move forward. Following Lincoln's assassination, the task of implementing Reconstruction fell to his vice president, Andrew Johnson. Johnson was a Democrat, as well as a Southern senator who remained loyal to the Union. At first, he seemed ready to take a hard line against the former Confederacy. He talked about punishing the traitors and breaking up large plantations, but at the same time, he supported states' rights and had very little sympathy for blacks. His policies after he became president were even more lenient than Lincoln's, and they caused a confrontation with the radical Republicans in Congress that ultimately would culminate in his impeachment. When Congress was out of session in May of 1865, Johnson started to implement his own Reconstruction program. Amnesty was granted to any Southerner who took an oath of allegiance, with the exception of some, like Confederate officials, officers, and wealthy landowners. Johnson appointed some provisional governors and authorized them to set up state conventions, which in turn were charged with declaring secession illegal, and also to repudiate Confederate debts and to ratify the 13th Amendment, which abolished slavery, outlawed slavery in the U.S. So once each convention's elections were held for governor, state legislators, and members of Congress, the states would be readmitted to the Union. Several states refused to either repudiate the huge debt produced by war or to unconditionally accept the 13th Amendment. Southern voters elected to Congress high-ranking Confederate officials and officers, not really supposed to do that, but they did, some of whom had not received one of the pardons that Johnson issued during the summer of 1865. The new state legislatures adopted what was called black codes as well as Jim Crow laws to attempt to keep newly freed African Americans, also called freedmen, in their proper social place. Blacks were required to either sign labor contracts or face arrest for vagrancy, and they were not allowed to serve on juries, nor were they allowed to testify in court. Despite these violations of both the letter and spirit of his program, the president announced that Reconstruction was complete in December of 1865. But Congress refused to seat the newly elected senators and representatives from the South. So lots of issues taking place during this time. Congress was divided among radical, moderate, and conservative Republicans and Democrats. Rather than working with congressmen who might have supported his Reconstruction plan, Johnson alienated potential political allies by vetoing legislation which was intended to ensure civil rights for freedmen, for African Americans sort of in general. A bill was introduced in February of 1866 to reauthorize the one-year-old Freedmen's Bureau and allow it to try in military courts those people who were accused of depriving former enslaved people of their rights. The Bureau was established in March of 1865, and it had provided blacks in the South with material assistance. So if they needed tools, anything to sort of help them get their life off the ground, because remember, nothing belonged to them. So material assistance, schools, right, helping them get education, and guidance in settling on abandoned land, guidance in the law and whatnot of what they needed to do. The new legislation was passed in July over Johnson's veto. The Civil Rights Act of 1866, which granted African Americans born in the U.S. the same rights as white citizens, also became law in April over the president's objection. Because of doubts about the constitutionality of the new Civil Rights Act, the Congressional Joint Committee on Reconstruction drafted the 14th Amendment to the Constitution, which ensures that all African Americans are full citizens of the U.S. It was approved by both houses in June 1866, and ultimately it repudiates, if you remember, the Dred Scott decision, which said that those of African descent were not citizens and therefore are not protected by the Constitution and couldn't bring suit before the courts and things of that nature. It states emphatically that, and I'm quoting here, all persons born or naturalized in the United States are citizens of the United States and of the state wherein they reside. End quote. It provides for due process and equal protection under the law. This amendment also denies to anyone who had participated in rebellion against the U.S. or had given aid and comfort to rebels the right to hold any national or state office. This exclusion was intended to sort of undercut Johnson's pardon policy. He gave out several thousand pardons to Confederates. So this was meant to sort of undercut that policy, as well as to protect the rights of African Americans, particularly those who were former slaves, and their right to vote. The first Reconstruction Act invalidated the state's government, the state governments established under Johnson's policies, and divided the former Confederacy into 5 military districts. State conventions elected by universal male suffrage. So universal male suffrage. So male suffrage, men have the right to vote. Universal, that's everyone. Every man has the right to vote. Let's see what we're talking about. State conventions. These are elected by universal male suffrage. We're supposed to draw up new constitutions which were obligated to give blacks the right to vote, and it had to be approved by Congress. In June of 1868, Congress determined that a couple of states, those being Alabama, Arkansas, Florida, Georgia, Louisiana, North Carolina, and South Carolina, had met the requirements, and those states were readmitted to the Union. When duly elected, black representatives were expelled, so they were cast out from the Georgia legislature. Georgia once again fell under military rule. Georgia, along with Mississippi, Texas, and Virginia, had to satisfy an additional condition. They had to ratify the 15th Amendment, which prohibits the states from denying a citizen the right to vote because of race, color, or previous condition of servitude. These 3 amendments, the 13th, 14th, and 15th, you really need to be familiar with them. They are rather important. So be sure to review the 13th, 14th, and 15th amendments. Make sure you know which one is which, because they will pop up later on. So once again, the 15th Amendment prohibits the states from denying a citizen the right to vote because of race, color, or previous condition of servitude. So these 4 states, Georgia, Mississippi, Texas, and Virginia, did not rejoin the Union until 1870 because they needed to fulfill these obligations. And I apologize for the movement. My hand is hurting. Ah! Okay, there we go. Let's see, where are we? Women's rights activists, probably the most famous are going to be Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton. These women are incredibly angry, incredibly frustrated that the 15th Amendment did not list gender among the conditions that could not be used to deny a citizen the right to vote. So in many ways, it's like they're saying all men are citizens, but women are not, right? So if you remember when we talked about the reform movements, there is a long-standing alliance that existed between women and abolitionists, and there was a falling out at one point, but the women were still very strong supporters of abolition. That alliance between the women's movement and abolitionists' cause broke, and women began struggling on their own for 50, 60 years for the right to vote. Under the Constitution, the House of Representatives acts as a grand jury in impeachment cases and determines whether there is enough evidence to bring an official to trial. In February 1868, there had been several months of investigation, and the House voted to impeach President Johnson. The grounds which they used to, as sort of like the foundation for this, was that Johnson had violated the Tenure of Office Act in firing Edwin Stanton. And you can read more about that in your book. It was left to the Senate to try the president and determine whether he should be removed from office. Enough Republican senators appreciated the fact that Johnson's offenses were political and that they did not fall under the, quote, high crimes and misdemeanors, end quote, specified in the Constitution for presidential impeachment. The vote in the Senate was 35-19 in favor of conviction. They needed just one more vote in order to have a 2/3 majority. So lots of crazy things going on. Reconstruction brought important social changes to former slaves. Families were reunited, and slave marriages were formalized and legally recognized. You have families taking advantage of the schools and other opportunities established by the Freedmen's Bureau. But there's still some issues. So they're still segregated in education. Some families, they're not going to be able to be reunited. Sometimes you have people who are technically married to more than one person. All sorts of issues like that. So even though they've gained, really we have sort of the same song but a different tune. Along with their frustrations, we have sort of the basic frustrations that you guys are probably familiar with. Money. How do we keep our family alive? How do we survive? And then politically speaking, there are several African Americans in the North that do have higher education and have been very involved. People like Frederick Douglass, and they're being denied access to certain positions. Any hope of large-scale property ownership by blacks really disappeared after the Civil War. For the most part, whites just kind of refused to sell land to former slaves. But at the same time, there are, lots of former slaves who don't have the money to buy land. So to kind of remedy the situation, I guess, it doesn't really remedy it, but we have sharecropping, which develops. White landowners would divide their plantations into, 30 to 50 acre plots. Blacks would lease the land, they would work the land, and then they would pay up to half of their crop to the owner, sometimes more, sometimes a little less. But this was a way that they were able to do what they were accustomed to doing, because I'm sure you can imagine if you've had one trade your entire life, if all you knew was picking cotton, it would be very difficult at that point to try to pick up another trade. So, and we do see lots of slaves staying on the same land as their original owners. So, they're free, but independence is sort of a relative term here. During Reconstruction, 14 black representatives and 2 black senators served in Congress, but no African American became a governor of a southern state. And only in South Carolina did the number of black office holders reflect their voting strength. Those elected were the African American elite. So these were going to be black men who had been free before the Civil War. They would have owned property. They were educated. And we also have many of them as members of the clergy. They were preachers. The African American voters helped keep Republicans in control of the former Confederacy, and they consistently went to the Republican Party in national elections well into the 20th century. But those Jim Crow laws and black codes that we mentioned earlier, they required certain things. They required literacy tests, like, okay, let's see if you can read in order to vote. They required sometimes a poll tax, so you had to pay a certain amount in order to vote. So there's lots of things that whites are doing to inhibit African Americans' voting ability. Also, when they're elected to office, they're not able to stay there for very long, because you have white officials and white citizens that are working to get them out of office very soon. And sometimes it's done by way of intimidation and force. So an example of this would be the Ku Klux Klan, formed in Tennessee in 1866. It was a secret society, which still exists, and ultimately it used intimidation and force, including murder, to advance white supremacy, as well as to end Republican rule. Organizations like this formed sort of like a covert alliance with the Democratic Party in the South, and played a key role in sort of bringing about life before slavery, sort of bringing about, sort of reestablishing what they believed to be the proper social order. Although the Klan was officially disbanded in 1869, Congress action against its activities in a series of laws, which were known collectively as the Enforcement Acts. This legislation was intended to enforce the 14th and 15th Amendments, and it made it a crime for anyone to interfere with the citizens' right to vote. As part of the Enforcement Acts, we have the Ku Klux Klan Act, which outlawed conspiring, wearing disguises like what you see in the image, and intimidating officials for the purpose of undermining the Constitution. In the long run, though, federal officials found it as difficult to root out the Klan and other secret societies or white supremacist groups as it was to make it possible for blacks to exercise their right to vote. So, again, same song, different tune. Ulysses S. Grant was, oh dear, again, I'm so sorry for the constant movement. Ulysses S. Grant was nominated as the Republican candidate for president in 1868. He was expected to earn the veteran vote. Remember, he was the one who accepted Lee's surrender at Appomattox. But he had a lack of political experience, which kind of showed him to be malleable, movable. I'm trying to think of a good word here. He was going to follow Congress, right? He's going to do what Congress is going to tell them to do. So there were weaknesses in Grant's leadership. There was definitely concern over the future of Reconstruction, and this ultimately caused a split in the Republican Party. But Grant was reelected. He served a full 2 terms as president. During his second term, Grant really was unable to curb the graft in his administration. In 1873, overspeculation in railroad stocks led to a major economic panic. The failure of an investment bank was followed by the collapse of the stock market and the bankruptcy of thousands of businesses. When we have crop prices plummeting, unemployment rising, much of the problem was related to the use of greenbacks or paper money, right, for currency. There were advocates of hard money, so using actual like gold or silver coins. They insisted that paper money had to be backed by gold to curb inflation and level price fluctuations. But farmers and manufacturers, those who owned factories and all, they need easy credit. Farmers in many ways are living debt to debt, right? They go and they get a loan and hoping by the end of the year they have what is necessary to pay the loan back, only to get another loan to help provide for producing next year's crop, right? So they need easy credit. They want more greenbacks put into circulation. And Grant ultimately opposed this policy. He recommended that greenbacks be redeemed in gold. So Congress enacted a legislation providing for the redemption of greenbacks in gold, trying to help sort of mitigate this problem. Because the Treasury needed time to build up its gold reserves, redemption did not go into effect for another 4 years, by which time the longest depression that Americans had suffered up to this point had finally ended. In 1872, Congress passed the General Amnesty Act, which removed all restrictions against former Confederate officials. Congress prohibited discrimination based on race in public places and guaranteed the rights of blacks to serve on juries through the Civil Rights Act of 1875. The legislation, however, was not enforced, and by 1876, both political parties were ready to basically abandon Reconstruction and its legacy. In 1883, the Civil Rights Act ultimately was declared unconstitutional. So 1876, the Republicans are looking for a presidential candidate who, hadn't been touched by any scandal. And they chose Rutherford B. Hayes, who had a reputation for honesty. That stated, the election turned out to be the most controversial in American history. Although earning 300,000 more popular votes than Hayes, Tilden won just 184 electoral votes, which was 1 vote short of the majority needed for election. 20 electoral votes from Florida, Louisiana, Oregon, and South Carolina were in dispute, as both political factions traded charges of ballot fraud. The Constitution offered no guidance on how to resolve the matter. In January 1877, Congress appointed a very special commission made up of 7 Republicans, 7 Democrats, and 1 independent to investigate these contested electoral votes. However, when the independent resigned, he was replaced by a Republican. So not surprisingly, the commission voted in favor of Hayes. So the man with the reputation for honesty has the most controversial election up to that point. Congress was ready to declare Hayes the winner of the election, but the Democrats controlled the House of Representatives, and they threatened a filibuster. And a filibuster is where basically you have a congressman who goes and just sits and he just talks like for hours and hours and hours and hours and hours, right? They prohibit certain things from taking place that would ultimately delay final action in determining who would be president. So, in return for an end to Reconstruction, Southern Democrats would abandon Tilden, and they would ultimately say, okay, fine, Hayes can be president. The Compromise of 1877 made Hayes president in return for a Republican pledge to remove federal troops from Louisiana and South Carolina, an action that would bring to a close the very last vestige of military occupation of the South. Democrats also wanted a Southerner appointed to Hayes' cabinet, as well as money for internal improvements, specifically a subsidy for a transcontinental railroad along a southern route through Texas. For their part, congressional Southerners agreed to support the civil rights constitutional amendments. With the end of Reconstruction, the Republicans effectively abandoned Southern blacks. The years ahead saw segregation institutionalized, and the rights of African Americans were very sharply curtailed by state law, particularly the right to vote. Politically, the Democrats controlled what became known as the Solid South until the federal government once again committed itself to protect all citizens regardless of race. In the 3 decades following the Civil War, millions of people poured into the West. They came from farms as well as cities in the East and the Midwest. We also see some coming from Europe and from Asia because of the promise for cheap land, for gold, because we've got the gold rush that has happened at different times, most notably the gold rush of 1849. Or really just the possibility of a better life. Many traveled on the newly constructed transcontinental railroads, while others crossed plains and mountains by wagon trains. You hear about the wagon trains, right? John Wayne, all that good stuff. Or they sailed around South America to arrive on the West Coast. In settling there in the Great Plains in the Southwest, along with other places. These people are enduring great hardship and danger, as well as disillusionment. By the end of the 19th century, the Western migrants had established new farming homesteads, communities, and industries. From the beginning, settlers and the Plains Indians really misunderstood each other in several ways. Non-Indians seldom respected the religions of native tribes, which were polytheistic and included the worship of plant and animal spirits. Additionally, natives lived under a complex kinship system of extended families that outsiders found difficult to comprehend. But there also we have a differing concept of land ownership. A rather small number of Native Americans roamed over a vast stretch of territory that they claimed as sort of like a communal hunting ground. And whites saw this as a waste of land and expected the area to be surveyed and sold for proper exploitation. Because of these cultural differences, among other things, settlers viewed the native peoples of the West simply as savages and barriers to civilization. So if you remember our picture of Lady America, all of that good stuff, yeah. Beginning in the 1860s, the federal government's policy was to establish small tracts of land for specific tribes and encourage them to take up agriculture. These tracts of land were called reservations, and some tribes did settle peacefully, as we saw with Chief Joseph's father. Others resisted giving up their lands and their way of life. But they never presented a united front. Even so, they definitely caused quite a bit of consternation with the U.S. Army. Between the 1860s and the 1880s, the various military confrontations that took place between the Army, settlers, and Native Americans are collectively known as the Indian Wars. At Sand Creek in Colorado, for example, more than 300 Arapaho and Cheyenne people, both, all men, women, and children, were massacred by the militia in 1864. At the Battle of Little Bighorn in the Montana Territory, a combined force of Sioux and Cheyenne killed all 200 men under the command of Lieutenant Colonel George Custer in 1876. In the Southwest, Apaches fought against settlers and soldiers for decades. Resistance there only came at an end with the capture of the Apache chief Geronimo in 1886. On the Great Plains, the loss of the bison was an even greater threat to Indian survival than the wars with the U.S. Army. The Plains Indians relied on bison for food, for clothing, for shelter. They also used it as a source of fuel for their fires. And the Army began to use this sort of as a policy. Get rid of the bison. We can sort of weaken them and subdue them easier. Railroads hired hunters such as Buffalo Bill Cody to kill thousands of bison in order to feed the workers laying the tracks for the transcontinental lines. When the railroads were completed, you have sportsmen, so hunters that just want to come out, like in many ways like wealthy men, come out and shot bison from chartered cars. By 1875, more than 9 million bison had been killed for their hides, which were in demand in the East. In another decade, the species was almost extinct, and the Plains Indians had very little choice but to accept life on the reservations. And they were in many ways desperate to restore their past. So we see the Plains tribes attracted to a religious movement known as the Ghost Dance, which promised to restore bison herds and protect Native Americans from U.S. soldiers and settlers. The popularity of this religious revival among the Sioux in particular concerned the settlers and the army, because they thought it was a resurgence of Indian resistance. So they tried to ban the ghost dance. And when that failed, more direct action was taken. Sitting Bull, who fought against Custer at Little Bighorn, was killed while being taken into custody by reservation police. 2 weeks later, December 29th, 1890, the 7th Cavalry killed more than 300 Sioux people, men, women, and children, at Wounded Knee Creek in the Dakota Territory. And that confrontation ultimately marked the end of Indian resistance. So that is where we will end for today, and we'll come back again later.